Hello, welcome to Book Lust. I'm Nancy Pearl. My guest today is Marie-Helene Bertino, whose new book, Beautyland, just delighted me. Marie, thank you so much for finally, we get to meet, even though it's virtually. I'm so happy about that.
I'm delighted. Thank you so much for asking me to join you, Nancy. It's a delight.
Of course. I kept waiting for you to come to Seattle for when we were doing these in person, but um, something, I don't know, it never happened, but here we are. And I have all of these, I'd just like to say how wonderful your writing is. And, your first novel, 2 a.m. at the Cat's Pajamas, was one of my all-time favorite books, certainly of that year that it came out. And then Parakeet, your second novel, and now Beautyland, which just was, again, I just love your imagination. When you were talking to your agent about Beautyland, how did you describe the book?
I described well, first, can I say, Nancy, that it is such a supreme honor to be on Book Lust. Our household is a Nancy Pearl household. We love your bobbleheaded doll. You are America's librarian. I consider you to be a national treasure. So this is an honor.
Thank you.
How I explained Beautyland to my agents was very, I would say, cryptically. I told her that it was based on a short story that I wrote about an unnamed alien faxing notes on human beings to who she believes are her superiors, and essentially like the sketched out bullet points of what would become Beautyland. But no, I didn't tell her all that much. But my agent, the very wise Claudia Ballard, who's been with me for a long time now, said there was something in the way I was talking about the book that made her think we should sell it alongside the novel Parakeet without it being written, which I had never done. But
Uh-huh.
she had a feeling, she had a hunch just because of, I think it was some kind of optimism or joy I exuded when I was speaking about the book that made her think, I think this is going to be different from your other books, and I think we should sell it right away.
Mm-hmm. I mean, one of the things that I think your books do is show how much you love your characters, and and how, and because of that, I think, because there are some authors who don't love their characters, and their I think, and their characters then have a kind of distance both from the author and from the reader. But I felt right from the beginning that you just adored your characters, and it was a pleasure for you to spend time with them. I know that's a little hyperbole. I mean, because of how hard writing is, but and then it becomes a pleasure for the reader as well. Does that make sense?
Oh, it makes sense. And I love that idea and question so much because as soon as you said it's evident that you love your character, I immediately thought, well, that's wonderful. And I'm glad that comes through. But I think it's intrinsically linked to whether an author loves or regards their reader. And perhaps that's a more general note about how they feel about human beings.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't mean to to say that ironically, since Beautyland is literally about how one cares for human beings. But I do think my philosophy about what we are to one another bleeds through all of these craft decisions.
Mm-hmm.
And so I appreciate that very much. And I hope that you also think that though I love Adina, which I do, I also love her enough to be honest about her, to not go easy on her. I had a really wise professor in my MFA program who said, you have to be, Stacy Durazzo, actually, a wonderful writer, who said, you have to be willing to get down in the mud with your characters.
Mm-hmm.
And so I do, I have a high regard for all of my characters because in order to write them, I have to know where they're coming from. and I have to understand their motivations, and I find it's impossible not to like them when I fully understand them. And that's what I'm always hoping that the reader understands too, that I don't think there's any truly unlikable character. I think there are only characters who you don't feel like you know enough yet.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's a very generous view of humanity.
Yeah, maybe it is. You caught me.
And the other thing, before we go into, the plot of Beautyland and Adina and all of her what she's doing in this world, I just have to say the other thing that was so noticeable to me are the dogs. I mean, I think you're so good with dogs and you're so good with adolescent girls. And where did those two things come from?
Well, it might not come as a surprise to you, but I used to be an adolescent girl.
I was just going to say that. Yes. Did you make notes?
um,
I mean, did you
did I
keep?
make notes? I definitely, I've written since I had conscious memory. I've always wanted to be a writer. And I think those were that was and continues to be the way that I take notes on human beings, for sure.
Mhm.
And I've always loved dogs. I've always loved animals. I've always felt a particular kinship to animals. And I think that seems to be automatically coming through in the stories that I write.
Yeah, I still remember with such fondness the dog in 2 a.m. at the cat's pajamas, and part of the story is even told from his viewpoint, right? Am I remember?
That's right.
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
right. Pedro. And I
yeah.
thought, oh gosh, no one's ever going to let me write from the point of view of a dog, but I loved him. And you always get the question, who is the autobiographical character in your novel? And in 2 a.m. at the cat's pajamas, I used to say Pedro, because he
Uh,
had wanderlust, and he didn't want to answer to a master, and he did what he wanted. And I loved that dog.
yeah, yeah. And so, because I've always felt, talking about the autobiographical character in your story, that's so interesting because I've always, the way you put it, I hadn't ever heard it put that way. But that's so true. I mean, I was just thinking about, the novel that I wrote was there. It's not autobiographical at all. I mean, I just drew things from everybody that I knew, including myself. But if there is oh gosh, that's a really interesting way of putting it. Um,
Are you are you thinking of your own work with kind of building the character in that way?
well, when in the novel George and Lizzie, which sort of came. Wait a minute, this interview is not about my book, it's about your book. Now, we're going to go back to Beautyland. Um, so many children's books or books for young adults um, are the kids are orphans, and certainly when I was growing up, that was so true that kids were orphans, and these were stories about them being adopted or being not adopted and what was going to happen to them. And somebody said way back then in a talk that I heard is that there are all these books with orphans because every child wants to be an orphan, doesn't want their parents around. And now I was thinking when I read Beautyland that that we all think that we're so different from everybody else. Maybe we're from a different planet, and you've taken that idea of that feeling of alienness that everybody has. I'm convinced at one time or another, and you've made it true, and that's just so brilliant. I'm just thrilled. So where did that? So you had on the one hand this short story about the man who's faxing, or the being who's faxing to somebody, and how did it go from that to Beautyland?
Well, and I agree with you and what you say about everyone having that feeling that perhaps they are an extraterrestrial in some capacity, especially since publishing the book, I've heard from so many people from such a wide variety of backgrounds who say, I am Medina. I feel like she feels because of this, because of that. And therefore and for so many different reasons, which has been so unexpected and personally gratifying. And I wrote the short story at first because I had myself been taking notes on all of the things about human life and society and customs that baffle me. And so I kept a folder on my desktop called Notes on Human Beings, where I would put things that also delighted me and that I wanted to remember. Um, in ways it helped me remember certain people I had lost. Like, for example, my grandmother, who used to rip the addresses off of her magazines before she donated them to the local hair salon. And if she had forgotten to do that, she would run down there and rip her address off. And conveying to me, if you leave your address on a People magazine, a murderer will find that magazine and go to your house, and it's curtains for you. And so these little idiosyncrasies of her and people I love and just life in general, I was collecting in this folder. And after I used that folder to write the short story, I found very quickly that I was not finished. And I kept throwing notes into the folder. It grew and grew until, a few years ago, 6 or 7 or 8 years ago, I thought, I wonder if there's a novel in this. But to write the novel would mean I would have to give this creature, this alien creature, a location, a name, a family. I would have to fix her in place on Earth. And that began the fun slash the challenge. And when I realized that I was going to have to get very specific about her and where she lived, I decided to lend her how I grew up and where I grew up. Because another parameter of the project for me was, could I write a literary novel set in the kind of place where I grew up, Northeast Philadelphia, with the kind of people I grew up around, from the point of view of a character and a single mom that had nothing, that had no resources. And could I put this element of magical vocation and important vocation on the shoulders of a person who might seem very unlikely to most people, but to me seems like a likely candidate for that kind of responsibility, for that kind of human responsibility of documentation. So that's how the novel grew, and then it was just up to me to figure out what to include and what to do to her during her Earth life.
When you write, at that point, did you outline chapter by chapter or incident by incident or?
No, that would have been very helpful, but I didn't. I had a rough sense that I was going to write it chronologically, and I knew it would be her entire lifespan, which was a graduation from all of my books. As you know, 2 a.m. at the Cat's Pajamas was 24 hours, a set of 24 hours. And then Parakeet was a week, and now Beautyland is an entire lifespan. And so I did not outline her life, but I had the rough chronology in mind. And it was meant to be a novel told in vignettes because I love vignettes.
Yeah.
And the first pass of it showed me very quickly that it was too hard to sustain 350 pages of vignettes that were meant to document someone's entire life. So I had to group them in some way, but I knew that a conventional kind of chapter format wouldn't really work for this story. So I kind of assigned it to my subconscious and hoped the answer would come. And like everything else when I am able to do that, the answer came in a kind of an uncanny way, which was I looked to where the vignettes were naturally grouping, and they became kind of 5 eras in her life. And when I Googled the number 5 to see if it had a celestial significance, it very shortly arrived that the lifespan of a star is set in 5 eras as well. So the
Oh,
book takes its structure from the lifespan of a star, which felt very appropriate to me in the story.
yeah, right. When you got to the end of Adina's life, um, did the book become harder to write? Did you kind of delay because you didn't want to get there?
That's a good question. I don't, I maybe delayed a little bit. I think even more so than delaying, I went very, very slowly.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt like, okay, this is my gravest responsibility to write this part and honor her and honor the people I've lost and what I know about end of life as well. Because while I was writing this book, I went back to school to get a certification in end of life facilitation.
Oh.
So I was also learning about the end of life process and what that looks like. And so I weaved a few of those details into the death scenes in the novel. And that helped too. But more than anything, I just wanted to do right by this character. And that doesn't mean go easy on her, like I said, but to not look away and to show it all the way and to be honest about not only her life but how she leaves the world.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's so interesting how taking that course in end of life. I mean, those kind of coincidences always fascinate me. I mean, it's not exactly a coincidence, but it brings up things like, karma and fate and free will and all of that kind of stuff. Are you? Was this? Was one of your novels harder than the others to write? And when you published 2 a.m. at the Cat's Pajamas, it was after your collection of short stories, right? Your short stories came up first, and then 2 a.m. So moving from the short story format to the novel, the expansiveness of the novel, even though that book is set over 24 hours, which I love. The eve of New Year's. What was it? What made you want to write that first novel, and what keeps you going novel by novel?
Hmm. Well, up until I wrote Cat's Pajamas, I thought I would only write short stories because I considered them and still consider them now to be my first love. I love the short story form. I actually am going to have a collection published next year, my second collection. But, and I was just listening to your interview with Elizabeth McCracken actually, and she was talking about how she knows the difference between what is a novel and what's a short story, and she knows immediately. I think that happened to me as well when I thought of the characters of Cat's Pajamas, that they would take a little bit longer to develop and reach their conclusions and live their lives and on the page. And that was a quality of noticing that I was only just beginning to understand when I began Cat's Pajamas. So I would say that for many reasons, that being one of them, Cat's Pajamas was the hardest novel I've written because in addition to just learning how to write a novel, it had the added challenge of having to prove to me that I could write a novel at all.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that you only have to do once. After you write your first novel, you never again have to worry that you can't write a novel because you have written a novel. And so Parakeet, I didn't have to get over that obstacle as well because I had already read I had already written Cat Pajamas. So the first was hardest for me, but not to say that, the other two or those to come won't be hard in their own ways, but they won't also have to prove to me that I can do it.
Do it.
Right, yeah, yeah. And do you have an idea for a new novel? Are you thinking about it?
I'm making notes, and I have a first draft. It's actually a trilogy that I've wanted to write for years and years and years. But because of my teaching schedule, I haven't been able to have the uninterrupted concentration time that I will need, because they're all interconnected, the three novels, and I kind of have to build them all at the same time.
Right.
So it's interesting. I will have to. This project will also be teaching me whether or not I can do this, and hopefully each project is a new stab in scary and heretofore unexplored terrain.
I recently met a little girl who doesn't start a series of books until she's 11. She doesn't start a series of books until all the books in that series are published. And I totally get that because I remember when The Lord of the Rings was published when I was little, a tween, a young teenager, I think, and we had to wait a year between the first book, Fellowship of the Ring, and The Two Towers, till it came, was published in the U.S. from its English publication, and how frustrating it was, and how I always felt that I needed then to go back and reread the Fellowship of the Ring before. So, kudos to that little girl. I think she has the right idea.
What a savvy 11-year-old. I would have had no idea how to do that when I was 11, because my favorite books were like the Black Cauldron series that Lloyd Alexander wrote and Madeleine L'Engle. And I didn't even realize writers were people at that time, let alone that books were something that were like written by people and published. I would have no idea, but I came to those series after those authors had written them. So I was very lucky. I got to read them all at once and then reread them over and over again.
So fantasy was one of your loves as a child?
As a young...
Deep love. Deep love, absolutely.
Yeah, me too. Me too. And who do you read now? What are you reading these days? Or do you avoid reading particular types of books when you're working on or thinking deeply about a new work?
I can always read poetry no matter what. And poetry helps me with the line. So I very much enjoy contemporary poetry. The New York School. I love the poetry of Ross Gay. So poetry is my constant companion. Also, I grew up and I wanted to be a poet, and I am now a failed poet. So that to me is one of the highest art forms, poetry. And it's interesting. I think my love of fantasy as a child has grown into a love for uncanny fiction, uncanny contemporary fiction now, though I love realism as well. But this summer, for example, I'm going to be reading Mariana Enriquez and Samantha Schweblin. And a few summers ago was my contemporary Japanese female short story summer, where I read Yoko Ogawa and Teiko Kono and all of these brilliant, beautiful contemporary authors who are writing in this uncanny realm from Japan, and they've been massively inspiring. But I don't see them as removed from the works I loved when I was little, like the Lord of the Rings series, and I just see them. I see them all as siblings of that what if, of that big what if. What if the things we feel actually are possible, and what if the things we feel could happen? What would that look like?
So Kelly Link, was she? She would fit into that category. Yeah.
Yeah.
Amy Bender was a huge touchstone while I was learning how to do whatever it is that I do. Yeah, all of those.
So what's one? I know you teach writing. at various places. And what's the most important bit of advice that you would give, that you do give to someone who wants to be a writer?
Who wants to be a writer? So, I mean, so many, depending on the writer and depending on what they ask. I think that the best advice I ever received was the simplest and the hardest, and remains the simplest and the hardest, which is just keep writing throughout everything, throughout the hard times, throughout the good times. It's not different from your life. It is your life. It is the way that you are expressing what it means to be human on Earth is the writing to me. And so I think of that. A professor told me that when I was having a tough time in college, keep writing, keep writing. But also, I've developed the belief that so many things are writing. And so you'll hear the maxim, write every day, which has never worked for me because I've never been able to write every day. But I do have a very generous definition of what writing is. So talking about writing, reading, going for a walk, paying attention in any way, shape, or form, talking to one's mother, like I did earlier today, hearing about a fun lunch she had yesterday. As long as you're noticing the world and you are keeping track of and always working the muscle of noticing what you're noticing, I feel like all of that falls into the same basket that I call writing. So that helps me. That helps me a lot, and it tends to help, especially emerging writers, feel, it takes it takes them off the hook a little bit. That pressure to constantly be producing pages. Sometimes that's not the right thing to do. Sometimes it's a gathering period, a listening period, a period of research and art dates, a period of saying, okay, this summer I'm going to watch all of the movies of Chantal Akerman and things like that. And I think that counts.
Yeah, wow. Well, that's a good note for us to end the interview on. Thank you so much, Marie. And I can't, of course, wait for your collection of short stories to come out, not to mention the trilogy.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. My honor.
Bye-bye.